let's begin. My presentation is titled Promoting Language and Learning in Children with X and Y Chromosomal Variations, and this is a presentation specific to behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, which is commonly known as ABA or ABA therapy. My name, as James said, and you can see on the screen, is Natalia A, Krum, and I am a board-certified associate behavior analyst. I'm consulting with children and families here in Charlotte, North Carolina for an agency called Carolina Center for ABA and Autism Treatment. And I have been working with families and children with multiple disabilities for a little over 6 years. Like I said, questions will be at the end, or James, if you can feed them to me. If there is anything that's unclear or you weren't able to hear me clearly, or I wasn't clear on something that I'm presenting at the moment, feel free to stop me, and we are going to have more detailed questions at the end. So first of all, as you may all be aware of the challenges for children that have X and Y chromosomal variations, the language delays, I believe, is a big challenge, mainly for expressive language skills. Some children with these disorders develop language slower, and their expressive language is an area that is of difficulty. Receptive language is said to be at common or quote-unquote normal levels, but there's still some children that have difficulty with that. There are learning and academic difficulties, mostly reading and writing or the verbal skills due to the language delays are affected. And other developmental challenges include motor skills development, self-help skills, and social skills. So this presentation is focused on ABA therapy, and I'm trying to basically show you in an hour, which is not enough to go through ABA therapy and all the principles of applied behavior analysis, but the presentation's goal is to show you how ABA can help with some of these challenges. So first off, what is applied behavior analysis? I think I skipped. Oh, no, I didn't. It is defined as the science of behavior. So it is a science that has been proven, and it's based on evidence-based methods. It is a scientific approach for observing, analyzing, understanding, and changing people's behaviors. It is based upon the principles of learning and behavior. And when I refer to behavior, or when we refer to behavior, we are not only referring to problem behavior. It is normally a common belief that when we mention behavior, we're working with behavior, or I say I'm a behavior therapist, it's usually understood as I work with problem behaviors only. When we refer to behavior, we are talking about all kinds of behavior, and that can be tying shoes behavior, or washing hands behavior, potty training. That can be language too, and that's an area that we're going to go to in detail today during this presentation. So ABA therapy is the therapy that uses applied behavior analysis. It is not autism therapy, and that's another big misconception out there, and I believe it was it grew out of so much research that was done with children with autism and showing that ABA therapy is a really effective approach in teaching children with this disorder, but this is not a autism therapy. ABA therapy is effective to treat any type of behavior, and like I mentioned on the slide, it can be effective to decrease behavior that is problematic, so problem behavior like we just mentioned, or teach appropriate skills. So it just changes behavior. Behavior, like I mentioned before, referring to any thing that we humans do, and changing, referring to decreasing that behavior or increasing it, meaning teaching it. And usually ABA interventions place a strong emphasis on reinforcement procedures, so they're very positive, and they enable learning and development in a consistent structure and positive environment. I wanted to outline quickly, just because we mentioned that ABA therapy is not autism therapy, what ABA therapy can be effective in helping with. It can be effective in decreasing problem behaviors such as the following: meltdowns or aggressive behaviors, self-injurious behaviors, attention difficulties, disruptive behaviors, oppositional or defiant behaviors, difficulty waiting, difficulty accepting no, and that is when they're told no, food refusal or selectivity, hyperactivity, or problem behaviors at school. That is not including, of course, all of them, but just a list of problem behaviors that we usually treat. Also, ABA therapy can be effective in teaching appropriate behaviors, such as language and functional communication, and that's an area that we're going to be going into detail today. Early learning skills, on-task behaviors, compliance, independent living skills and self-help skills, appropriate play, toilet training, social skills, and academic skills. ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, is focused or based on the principles of behavior and learning. Specifically, it was based from Skinner's Operant Conditioning theory, and that theory basically states that learning occurs because of the consequences. And Skinner used the principles of operant conditioning to explain why people do what we do. And most of those principles, there's 7 principles that we're not going to go into detail today, but I wanted to mention these 4: reinforcement, punishment, motivation, and stimulus control. The 2 that we're going to focus on, because they're the main principles, and I believe most of the basis for ABA therapy that focuses on skill acquisition, are reinforcement and motivation. And this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about behavior reduction, but it's going to be focused on skill acquisition, or just teaching, basic learning, and language skills. So reinforcement and motivation play a big part in these programs. I also wanted to explain verbal behavior. I'm not sure if some of you have heard of that, but it is called the verbal behavior approach to ABA therapy. Many think that it's just a substitute for ABA therapy or a different sort of therapy, but the verbal behavior approach is ABA therapy. This is just a sort of a branch of ABA where it's focused mainly on language, and it applies all of the same behavioral principles to verbal behavior, which is language. It considers language just as a behavior like everything else, and like any other behavior, it states that language is learned, and it's based on that theory. Also, language is shaped by the environment. We're going to see a little bit more about shaping later in the presentation, and language serves a function. And using that approach to language, we treat it and really treat the reason why children are using language, different from speech therapy or other approaches where the focus is more on what the child is saying. ABA therapy, or the verbal behavior approach, focuses on the reason why, and we're going to see that the language is divided into different operants based on the function or the reason why the child is using language. So the behavioral view on language is that language is organized by function, again the why of the language or that behavior, and not the form of it. So these are the operants of the verbal behavior organized by function. We have Mands, Echoic, Tacts, and Intraverbals. Mands are specifically requests. So these are just requests for desirables, for items that the child or the person wants at that moment or needs. A man can be cookie, a man can be a request for information too, so a man can be when are we going to the store, or what is it, that could be a man. And the function of it or the reason of it is looking for information or looking to gain access to an item or an activity. The echoic is just repeating, is vocal imitation. The tacts are labeling behavior, and that basically follows a different chain and a different function from Mands, because the child may be just labeling the item, not necessarily requesting it. So, for example, to give you a quick comparison between Mands and tacts, if I ask the child, what is this, while I'm showing him a pen, and he says pen, I can say, yay, great, this is pen. That would be functioning as a label. If I hold the pencil or the pen and he says pen, reaching for it, and I give it to him, it will be functioning as a request. And this becomes very important, this distinction, later as I show you the assessments and intervention practices, because this distinction is crucial in treating language and teaching language to children. Intraverbals is the other operant, and it's it's basically conversation skills, beginner conversation skills. It begins with fill-ins, just for example, me saying pop goes the, and the child says bubble, or animal sounds, cow says moo, and it can go all the way up to answering questions in detail about current events and maintaining a conversation as well. Skill assessments. I wanted to go into assessments first to let you see two assessments that usually are used for skill acquisition programs based on the ABA or the verbal behavior approaches. Usually I believe assessments are extremely necessary. If it's a functional behavior assessment for a behavior reduction program, that is definitely the first step in determining what the intervention is going to be. The same is true for skill acquisition plans, where we are just looking to see what the child needs to know and develop an individualized program for the child. And this is a crucial point to know where to start, what the child knows. So the range of current language and other skills. What does he know? What does he not know? Where are we starting? What gaps need to be filled in different skill areas? And where is he developmentally or she compared to his peers? A good assessment is necessary to give it a starting place for individualized intervention. And I wanted to show you this video. I'm not sure if by going here everyone can see it. I'm assuming that's the case, hoping that's the case.
I believe that will work as long as you're showing it on your screen. We'll see it.
Okay, great. Oop. First, I want to explain the reason why I'm showing this video, and it's just a reason for assessing receptive language skills. Receptive language is what the child or the person is able to understand, their abilities to follow instructions, and just their ability to understand what's being said. So I wanted to show you this video quickly, and then I'll go.
If the video is playing, I don't think we're going to be able to hear the audio.
Okay, were you able to see it on your screen?
I can see the video progressing, but I don't hear any audio.
Okay.
We haven't tried that
tactic
before.
Okay, it's okay. It wasn't a very special video. It's a video in Spanish. And the reason why I showed that was to just demonstrate what behaviors, if you had the chance to listen to that, what behaviors you would be engaging in if I just like that randomly show you a video that's in Spanish. Many of you probably would just be startled and check that I chose the right video, or if you weren't paying attention, you would be on task listening to me then. Or, you know, later if I play the video for longer, you may just become fidgety, start making notes, just act confused and feel confused. There's many behaviors that can go on, and we're adults, and we know that to sit still and listen to something and we can pay attention for longer intervals of time. For children that don't understand language, and that was the reason for my showing of the video, it can be eventually a big reason for their behaviors, and it just makes sense for children that can't understand language. If we expect them to follow certain instructions but don't know what instructions they understand and can follow, that can in turn just present itself as an opportunity for problem behaviors and avoidance of tasks and just avoidance of academic activities, which we see very normally. And maybe even increase in escape behaviors, avoidance behaviors, maybe even aggressive behaviors, and that can stem off just not knowing what the child can and cannot do. There's two specific assessments that are widely used, and I wanted to go over. These are not standardized tests like the ones in the educational system or the ones psychologists implement. These are specific to the ABA and verbal behavior approach, excellent curriculum, and excellent skill tracking skills. And I'm going to go through the two of them. I hope you are able to see this clearly. Oh. Of course, I'm not expecting you to understand the chart, but this is the assessment of basic language and learning skills, which is the first one, and I'm sorry I skipped this one. The ABLLS was written first by Sundberg and Partington, and then it was recently revised in 2006. The verbal behavior milestones and placement program, which we're going to go through after the ABLLS, was written by that same author of the ABLLS later in 2008. So this is the ABLLS. That's the way it's pronunciated, kind of ABLLS, ABLLS. And it's a great skill tracking system. If you are able to see the bottom left of your screen and you see the color code and the assessment date, the first one was on May 08, and the color code is blue. And so if you look through the little skill blocks, you're able to see what the child knew back when that assessment was completed in 08. And that is divided into all the skill areas, and we're going to go into detail about what all of those skill areas represent. But basically the color blue represents the first assessment, and the color yellow represents the second assessment, showing progress in the specific skills. What's great about this assessment as well is that you can see not only where the gaps are in development, if there's any, but you can also see where to begin your instruction or your intervention plan. Again, it's very well divided into different skill areas, so you can see the skill area of interest and then plan an individualized program for the child based on your first assessment, and then just keep track of progress, and you're able to see that the child did learn or didn't learn, and then you need to modify your instruction or your plan, your treatment plan. So there are 9 areas, and I'm going to go back so you can see them, since I think the picture is big enough and we can see the titles. There's 3 whole pages of this chart. This first page goes from A to I, and it's all the basic learning skills. So for an early learner, these are the skills that we usually focus on because they are the main basis for learning language and for learning other skills. So the first one, the skill area A, it's the first column to your left, and that is cooperation and reinforcement effectiveness. And it basically assesses whether the child is able to approach instructors for instruction, whether the child tolerates instruction at all, whether he works at the table and is able to remain sitting, whether he waits without touching materials before the instruction is given, whether he responds to one instructor or multiple instructors. So it's just showing, is the child able to sit at a table or sit on the floor and work, and how much can he work? Can we give him just one instruction, or can he tolerate 3 in a row? And from those 3, can he tolerate 1 that he knows and maybe 2 that are new? or can he only tolerate one that is new and two that he already knows? So this is the first area, and this is really, I believe, one of the first steps, I believe one of the most important ones in assessing a child before you begin implementing any therapy or before you begin working, because you're able to see where the child is in terms of motivation and compliance, and really you want to see compliance before you begin teaching all other skills. Also, it allows you to assess whether there are some behavior problems, like I mentioned, maybe some escape behaviors, some avoidance behaviors, and if that is the case, then you can just go for a behavior reduction plan and work specifically on reducing those behaviors, and then move forward with your skills plan. So moving forward, the second column is the column B, and it's visual performance, and that includes everything related to matching to a sample, sequencing, patterns. It starts on B1, and I believe B1 is just doing a simple inset type puzzle, putting 3 puzzle pieces on the frame. And it goes all the way up to sequences, complex seriation, patterns on B. B27 actually is patterns. The column C, the third column, is receptive language. Like we were talking about, receptive language is whether the child is able to follow instructions and comprehend language. It begins with understanding or responding to their name. So are they looking at you, maybe just turning when their name is called? Are they able to follow instructions in context of a fun activity? So if we're jumping up and down on a trampoline and I say jump, will he jump? That's an instruction that's in context, and an instruction out of context would be, we're jumping on the trampoline and I ask him, hey, throw this on the trash, or can you put on your hat, which is somewhere else far from the trampoline. Would the child be able to not only understand that but also follow that instruction? You notice that the C column is pretty long and pretty high. It goes to C57 because it also involves picking out of a sample. So if I show him a cat, a horse, and a dog, and I ask him, show me the horse, that is one of the skills there. It also goes into show me the ones that you eat with, so items selected by function, or show me the ones that have stripes, items selected by feature, or show me the ones that are all animals, and that's by categories or classes. It also assesses their ability to follow instructions that include prepositions, pronouns, and different language components. The column D is motor imitation, and again it assesses various skills beginning with imitating simple movements, maybe touch head, and you just say do this. Is the child able to follow that? And it moves up to D27, assessing whether the child is able to follow a sequence of movements, imitate other peers, maybe spontaneously, imitate the intensity and the speed of a movement, imitate the number of repetitions. The same is true for vocal imitation for that next skill on column E. It also assesses imitation, but specifically vocal imitation. So say, is he able to repeat that sound? And then later on, is he able to repeat phrases? Is he able to repeat a sequence of numbers? Requests is column F, and that is probably the most important, after column A, the most important skill to assess, and definitely one of the skills that an ABA program or a verbal behavior program wants to focus on is requesting, and we'll go into detail about that later. But this specific column is assessing whether the child is able to request for wants and needs in his environment by signing, by exchanging a picture, by using vocal output devices, or by using words. Is he able to communicate what he wants and needs, and is he able to communicate, ask for information, so ask others to engage in actions or ask others for information. And it goes into asking all kinds of WH questions and more complex why questions. I'm sorry, not why, but can, do, will questions. The column G is labeling, and if you remember the verbal operants that we just went through, the F for request would be manding, and the G would be tacting. We'll go into detail about that later. But labeling would be just, hey, what is this? Like we went through that example. What is this pen? We're showing a child a picture of various items, and he can label what that is. And it goes all the way up, just like receptive language, also labeling different language components, prepositions, pronouns, and function, feature, class of items as well. And also labeling, I think, events in a picture. So it goes into descriptions and really more elaborate language skills. Intraverbals are conversation skills. So H1 begins with fun feelings, just feelings for songs. So itsy bitsy, the child feels spider, and goes into fun feelings for just phrases. So 1, 2, 3, go, and that's H1 and H2 beginner social conversation skills. It goes all the way to answering very detailed questions, describing events, and maintaining a conversation. Spontaneous vocalizations is specific for those children that are non-vocal, and we want to see them engage in spontaneous vocalizations. That's why there's not many items on the skill area I. But just to go over it again, so the blue boxes mean what the child was able to do on the first assessment. The yellow boxes are showing what the child is able to do on the second assessment. So it shows a little bit of progress through that intervention, and it also shows what goals you were working on for that individualized program. Other areas that I don't have on the presentation, as I said, there's 3 pages to it, and I just included the 1 page. It's the same exact, not the same exact, but the same format for assessing the other skills, and it includes syntax and grammar. So now you're going into analyzing their verbal language. Are they using contraction, conjunctions? Are they using the past tense appropriately, and all of that. Play and leisure skills and social interaction skills. From M to T, skill areas M to T, assess beginning academic skills, including group instruction and classroom routines. So it looks into the child's ability to follow routines in the classroom, like putting their backpack away. When they say, hey, everybody line up by the door, is he following instructions? And group instruction, is he able to sit down and listen to the teacher speak for 30 minutes, for 20 minutes? Is he paying attention? Is he speaking in turn? Is he raising his hand to speak? And it also goes into beginning academic skills that are reading, writing, math, and spelling. Skill areas U to X go through self-help skills. That's dressing, eating, grooming, and toileting. And the last 2 skill areas, Y and Z, assess gross motor and fine motor skills. So as you see, it's a very complex and very complete assessment, and it also serves as a skill tracking system and a curriculum for developing a program. It is not as complicated to fill in. If you know the child, it's actually very easy to do it. It can take time, so you can do it yourself, and I would encourage you to as a mom or a parent. But I would also recommend seeking the assistance of someone who has experience doing it. This is the second assessment that I wanted to discuss with you. This is called the Verbal Behavior Milestones and Placement Program. And it is a great assessment tool. Again, it was sort of the update of the ABLLS. It brings different components to the assessment that the ABLLS didn't contain. And it's a great tool for some children. Some children still benefit from the ABLLS more than the VB-MAPP. And it was developed by Mark Sundberg, the same author of the ABLLS, in 2008. So it's fairly new. Still people are sort of learning how to use it. And it's an assessment that you can use, and it's probably quicker to fill in and quicker to assess the child than the ABLLS. It's a little less complex. but it includes 170 verbal behavior milestones. What it includes that the ABLLS didn't have was the developmental levels. So it takes into account typical development and the exact order of those milestones in a typically developing child. So you have that comparison that the ABLLS doesn't have. And it has 16 other additional related skills like the ABLLS had, which is, again, excellent. This is the scoring form for the VB-MAPP. As you see, it has level 1, level 2, and level 3, and that is where the developmental ages come into play. We have the same sort of color system as the ABLLS here, where if you look on the top right of the screen, you see the first test. It's color yellow, and that basically in yellow means that those are the skills that the child has in his repertoire currently. This would show on green now the second test, and this is the skills that he now has in his repertoire after intervention. So it's showing what he was able to do first and then what he's able to do after the second test. Again, this is another skill tracking system that's excellent. You're able to plan the intervention based on this and see exactly where the child is and what gaps need to be filled. As sorry, I wanted to go back to this one because these are the 3 developmental levels. Level 1, the one on the bottom, is 8 to 18 months of typical development. 18 to 30 months is the second level, and 30 to 48 months is the third level. As you see, also every level is divided into different subtests or scale areas, and we have them more specific as far as the verbal operants that I spoke about earlier. The Mand, which would be the requesting for items or activities or requesting others for information. The Tact, which would be labeling items or labeling a picture, labeling a preposition, a pronoun. Listener skills would be the receptive language. The fourth column, it says VP-MTS. It's visual performance and matching to sample. So just like with the ABLLS, we have the puzzles, and we also have matching picture to picture or picture to object, and it becomes more complex on level 3 as we assess patterns and sequences. Imitation, echoic language is vocal imitation, play, social skills, and vocal skills. As you see on level 1, we only have vocal, and that's where it ends, but level 2 already expands into listener, repertoire, function, feature, and class. So that's receptive language again, but very elaborate and more specific as far as the child picking out the items that belong to a function, so all the ones that you eat with, or a class, a category, all the ones that are a food item, or a feature, all the ones that have black dots. The IV is the intraverbal skills, so those are the conversation skills that we talked about, and they're present on level 2 and 3. And then this is group and classroom instruction and linguistics goes through reading and some writing, I believe. But on level 3, you have it well specified. Because of the age component, you have it divided into here: math, reading, writing, social behavior, intraverbals, group and classroom routines, and linguistics. So as you see with age, the age component, the skills get more complex as you go up, filling the skills scoring form with the child. So the goal for this is to visually be able to see and fill up all of level 1 before you move on to level 2, to make sure that the child is developing at an appropriate rate in all the skills. The problem that they were seeing with the ABLLS was that maybe a child would have excellent manding skills, he would be requesting beautifully, so on that ABLLS maybe the F column was all filled up, but they were not so strong on their tacting, so they weren't able to label much. It's actually, well, to give you a real case scenario, we see the problem the other way around. where kids can label anything, and most of their comments or conversations are about labeling, but they're not manding. So they can say, hey, pen, box, car, and then you say, what do you want? And they're unable to communicate their needs and wants. And so that disconnect is something that this assessment takes care of, because we really want to make sure that the child is developing at an appropriate rate. The VB-MAPP also has two different components that the ABLLS didn't bring to the table that are excellent for children that would benefit from ABA programs. And it's just an assessment to identify barriers to language and learning. Barriers include different behaviors. We have here some weak motivation, not interested in anything, or maybe the motivation is there and the child loves watching movies, and but as soon as I say, okay, let's do this first, let's do the puzzle first, and then you can watch a movie, the movie lost value completely, and it's like, okay, I don't want to anyway, and I lose motivation, and I lose the child. He's not complying with my demand to do the puzzle first. Self-stimulatory behaviors, maybe not attending to people or material, not approaching the instructor, can be another barrier, or articulation problems. And that's just a few of the 22 different barriers that we can identify as far as things that would impede learning. And it's usually a great tool to have to just check and see where the child is behavior-wise, to make sure to see if you need a behavior reduction program first. Make sure you take care of some of the problem behaviors that are around tasks. So if you have any escape or avoidance behaviors, you can take care of those first before moving on to skill teaching. The other component of the VB-MAPP that is excellent is the transitions assessment, and it's really, really helpful for children that are transitioning into school settings. It is another subset of assessment skills, just like the one you saw on the chart, and it's 18 of them, and it determines how the child will be performing in a less restrictive educational environment. So it has everything, all the strengths and weaknesses. Is he able, again, to follow instructions? How can he tolerate a group instruction? And all of that. Does he need visual aid? And all of that will eventually let you see where the child may be placed or what placement would be appropriate for him. Also, this area, the transitions assessment, has a section for placement and IEP goals that I find really helpful when working with parents and children that are transitioning to school or from school to school, or children that have IEPs in place at school. When you complete the VB-MAPP skills and barriers assessment, so you have both of them, you can go to this section and it basically shows you, based on the findings of the assessment, what would be specific treatment plan goals that would be appropriate to introduce for the child. All of these, all the assessments and everything that we spoke about, what's great about these tools is that you're able to individualize instruction. So it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's not an instruction where you just have a manual for this specific age or for this specific developmental age, but you have literally a chart where you can see where your child is and move forward creating a plan of instruction. Like we mentioned with the barriers assessment, it's important to consider a behavior reduction plan first if it's necessary before beginning instruction. And just to keep in mind, we're going to go through different components of individualized instruction that's based on an ABA verbal behavior approach. And what's very special about this type of instruction, direct instruction, is that it's very child-specific and child-centered. So everything is around what the child enjoys, what the child can do, what the child is learning to do. And again, maybe one ABA plan for one child is completely different from an ABA plan for another child. Maybe the same age, you would look at them and think that they're on the same level, but the programs or the plans are completely different. It always follows the child's motivation, and we're going to see a little bit of that later, because every single program and every instruction trial or instruction moment with the child follows the motivation, and motivation is a huge component that really aids learning significantly. It takes into account the skills that the child has in his repertoire, so that is based on the assessment and on the findings. What is the child able to do and what you have to teach him, or what's necessary for him to learn at this level so that he can move on to the next one. And goals are always measurable and specific. A little bit of applied behavior analysis. We always analyze behavior in terms of the A, B, and C. So this is I would say one of the cornerstones of ABA. The ABCs of behavior are great for analyzing any behavior. Like we talked about earlier in the presentation, behavior can be anything from language, tying shoes, eating a cookie, telling a joke, or throwing on the floor and having a tantrum. That can be a behavior too. And every behavior can be analyzed in terms of their antecedents, their behavior, the behavior itself, and the consequence. If you remember my slides from earlier, one of Skinner's main theory, or again what ABA is based on, is that behavior is learned, and the consequence plays a major role in that behavior being learned. So we have the antecedent, which is the A, and states that it's specifically what happens prior to the behavior occurring. The B is the behavior itself, and the consequence is what happens immediately following the behavior. The consequence, it is a very misunderstood word, because as soon as we hear consequence, we think it's a punitive sort of consequence. When we consequate or give consequences to a child, we're thinking we're punishing a response, or we're punishing a behavior. And in this specific example, and when I refer to consequence throughout the presentation, we're referring to consequence as anything that happens following a behavior. So here are some examples of the ABCs of behavior. The first one is very common. Hi, what's your name? And the behavior is, hi, I'm Max. The consequence, nice to meet you, Max. So it's just to show you that we use ABCs all the time, and this is how behavior operates. The next example, please put your shoes away, a demand from a teacher or a mom, and the behavior is that the child drops to the floor and screams. The consequence in this case is that mom puts the shoes away, so the demand is withdrawn. Again, if you notice, the consequences in both of these examples are not punitive. They're just precisely what happened in the environment right after the behavior. The third example has show me the cow. This is clearly an instruction. The behavior, child points to the cow, and the consequence is great job, and he gets a sticker. So the consequence in this case, again, is something that follows the behavior immediately, and it can be a positive or a negative consequence. I did want to go into explaining, I think I'm missing a slide, that like I mentioned before in my last slide, the consequence plays a major role when determining what's going to happen to that behavior in the future. The consequence in this first example, hi, what's your name? Hi, I'm Max. Nice to meet you, Max. The consequence really is social validity, some social acknowledgement, maybe even praise, like great, hi, and it's a smile, and that's indeed a reinforcement for all of us. And that means that consequence right there, if the child, say, for example, is learning to answer that question and say that his name is Max, my happy, smiley response may make that behavior increase in the future. If that child enjoys praise and enjoys smiles and social acknowledgement, that consequence may function as a reinforcer for that behavior. So just giving him that smile and that social acknowledgement may make that behavior increase in the future. So he's going to want to say, answer that question more often. We all do that throughout our lives as adults, and children do that as well. We all respond to positive reinforcement. We work for, at the end of the week, we get a paycheck, and that eventually is our reinforcer. If we get a bonus at work, maybe we want to work harder. And that is true for all of us humans and even animals. Something else that's important is that sometimes we believe that any positive thing may be reinforcement, but like I mentioned with this example, if the nice to meet you, Max, and my smile is positive to that child, if he likes that social attention, if he likes that smile, that could function as a reinforcer. But on the third example, for example, he gets a sticker. This may not be a reinforcer for a child who doesn't like sticky things, or a child that just doesn't like stickers that much. He may enjoy drawing something versus getting a sticker. And so in this case, really, although the sticker is a fun item, it may not function as a reinforcement. On the second example, which is the most important one in explaining the whole reinforcement, mom puts the shoes away and the demand is withdrawn. That is not necessarily a positive consequence or a positive reinforcement. It's not that obvious that it is reinforcement, but it is, and in the sense that the instruction was withdrawn. Going to function, and I don't want to get much into the details of analyzing problem behaviors, but we usually always look at function of the behavior. In this case, the child's behavior by dropping to the floor and screaming. The reason why he did that, basically the function, is to get away from that instruction, get away from that demand, and the consequence eventually got that exact desire to get that demand withdrawn. And so mom puts the shoes away. He doesn't have to put the shoes away himself. And eventually in the future, that consequence alone reinforces that behavior. So in the future, if that situation plays again, he may drop to the floor and scream again, expecting the same consequence. So in this sense, the consequence increases that behavior, which makes that consequence a reinforcer. During instruction time, the ABCs are very similar. The A would be the instruction itself. So in this case, the teacher's instruction is to touch nose. The response is the child touches nose. And the consequence is, yes, that's your nose. Just, again, positive acknowledgement, maybe a high five, just any reinforcer in this sense that the child responds to. We're going to go into that into detail later. So as we are describing reinforcement, it is a consequence that increases the probability of the behavior to increase in the future. So like I said, it may be positive or negative. Sometimes it's not very obvious. It's not very out there. We're not able to identify it as reinforcement right away. But if the behavior happens again in the future, that consequence that was provided is very likely to be reinforcing. Also, like with the sticker example, an item or activity functions as a reinforcer only when it increases the likelihood of that specific behavior happening again. So only if the sticker increases that response, which was, I believe it was touch nose, and he does touch his nose, and I give him a sticker. Is he wanting to touch his nose again later? Is he wanting to follow my instructions more often? Is that behavior, which is responding to instruction, happening more often? If it's not, I may need to reconsider my reinforcements, and because that sticker itself may not be of value to that child specifically. Also, motivation for items shifts all the time and changes. So if I just had access to one of my reinforcers, if I just, one of my reinforcers is coffee. If I just had a big cup of Starbucks coffee and offered a Starbucks coffee for donating blood or doing something around the community, I probably won't be motivated to do that at that point because I just had my Starbucks cup of coffee. If I hadn't had it earlier, I may consider that. For a child, it's the same thing. If you're giving stickers, but he just had the chance to play with stickers earlier for about an hour and he's done with stickers, then the motivation is not there for that. Satiation is specific to edible reinforcers, because just like with the coffee example, if the child is able to eat candy and then I'm offering candy as a reinforcer for working, he may be just satiated. He had a little too much candy and he's not motivated for it. So in this case, like my coffee, the stickers or the candy for the child, they vary. The motivation for them always is changing. So they are reinforcers, but not at every time, at very particular times. So motivation is always something to consider. Like I mentioned, we all respond to positive reinforcement. And positive reinforcement is one of the most important tools for learning to take place, and it is one of the most important principles and tools that we use in every ABA program and verbal behavior program. How to develop reinforcers, because it's such an important part of working with a child and beginning the learning and language process. I wanted to go into detail as to how to develop them and how to make sure that the environment is a positive one where you can build up instruction. So the first step is to consider assessing potential reinforcers, just observing your child and seeing what his interests are. So are there any food or snacks that he enjoys, especially any snack or any food that are just favored? So is there any drink, any little snack that you could and you feel comfortable with giving him as a reinforcer for specific behaviors? Are there any favorite toys or favorite activities? What does he do, the child, when he's alone or during recess? That's a great observation period for anyone who's looking for potential reinforcers, because usually when children are not told what to do and there's no instruction, they're in recess time, they're alone, they would be engaged in their preferred activities. And that can be anything. If they're playing with cars, then you know that cars or play with cars is a favorite activity. If they're playing on their own, but maybe they're just grabbing some sticks from the ground, maybe hunting for sticks would be a great reinforcer. Like I mentioned, observe your child's play and see if there's any preferences, and those could always be potential reinforcers. Another way of assessing that, if there is a child that may not be very clear in what he enjoys, may be hard to see exactly what he's motivated by or exactly what he enjoys, or maybe those preferences change all the time. It would be really key to do a specific and very systematic reinforcer assessment. And for that, I would recommend you seek the help of a consultant or someone with knowledge in ABA therapy to assist you in completing it. And the way it's done is very systematically. You place activities maybe on a table or right next to the child, activities or items that you suspect you think he may enjoy, and you collect data on what he takes first and how long he takes it for. Would he just take it up and then put it back where he found it right away, or would he spend time playing with it or enjoying that item? So if you have maybe some chips and you have juice and you have a puzzle, what does he tend to gravitate to first? Maybe the chips right away, but would he eat just one chip and then leave it and go to the puzzle right away, or not mind those activities at all? So you're just basically presenting different options and seeing what the child responds best to. And that's the way you assess whether that could be a potential reinforcer or not. Choosing reinforcers, in choosing them for instruction, specifically for instruction, it's very important to consider variability. Consider that the reinforcers are individual to each child. So like I said, stickers are not always reinforcing, cookies are not always reinforcing, my coffee is not always reinforcing to me, and it's not reinforcing to every adult out there. It's very individual to me and my preferences, and that changes daily and changes depending on the situation, and changes depending on what I did earlier in the afternoon and whether I have enough motivation for coffee right now. It is usually very important, and a good suggestion it is to keep short reinforcers to use at the table. So always keep kind of a very, very varied reinforcer bin or reinforcer list. So don't pick just a couple, pick a few. I would say maybe 5, 10 items that you believe could be reinforcing to the child, and include short reinforcers to use at the table. So little things that you can control easily and give to the child at the table. Movement reinforcers, so that would include lots of social interaction with the child, maybe spinning around, swinging, jumping on the trampoline, going swimming. Edible reinforcers would be just little snacks to eat. Edible reinforcers are very easy to control, and they're very easy to use. Some parents are not very happy with giving the child edible reinforcers, but I haven't seen one child that doesn't respond to edible reinforcers during instruction. Usually they respond to it right away. They may respond to social praise only at the beginning, but eventually as the instruction becomes harder and more challenging, it's nice to have a backup reinforcer. Usually with edible reinforcers, the great thing is that you can break a little chip into tiny, tiny little pieces and control that, so you can deliver those tiny little pieces one by one, and really that the food doesn't add to much by the end of your instruction time. But if that is something that you may not consider, then consider other activities, but make sure that they're short, that you can give to the child, and you can keep control of those reinforcers. So you don't want to give a child maybe a handheld video game right away or at the beginning of your instruction time, because it will be probably hard to control taking it away from him to begin instruction again. So those, for example, are not very good reinforcers to control for the instructor, and not very good reinforcers to use at the beginning of instruction. You may use them at the end, maybe when he's all done working, or during breaks during activities. He can use that handheld video game or other activity that takes his attention, and those activities that you know are hard to take away from him. Movement reinforcers, like I mentioned, are easy to control for the instructor, more so if the activity itself is more fun because the instructor is present. We're going to talk about pairing and associating the instructor with fun activities later. But the whole idea is to make sure that the child is having fun on his own, but when the instructor is present, that activity became way more fun just because that instructor is present. And that instructor can add so many more elements to that activity, so many more action movements, so much more social interaction, and that becomes a reinforcer. And it's really easy to control that for the instructor because it's the instructor delivering that. So say, for example, my reinforcer is music, dancing to music. Listening to the music and dancing on his own for the child is not as rewarding as having me as the instructor jump in with him and dance around, jump around, bring the trampoline over, and start jumping to the beat of the music. That makes it way more exciting, maybe even sitting on the ground and rocking back and forth with him, spinning around in circles while we're listening to the song. That makes it way more fun than listening to the music on his own and dancing on his own. So in that event, I have control of that reinforcer because I can deliver a few instructions and then say, hey, let's spin, play my music, spin around, and then just stop it because I'm the one providing that activity. I'm the one saying, hey, spin. If the child is not ready to come back for instruction, I'm waiting until he comes back. He doesn't have that extra element, which would be me spinning around with him. He will be playing on his own, and so in that way, I have control over that reinforcer. Oh, and I forgot, always considering the child's motivation. That's very, very important. The motivation for the child to listen to music in that example I want to make sure the child is not tired. Does he look like he had a good night's sleep? Did he have a good night's sleep? Did he have a good day at school? Does he seem active? Does he want to engage in movement, or is he just sitting there and he seems tired? If that's the case, maybe I want to grab a book and read a book with him if the child likes books, instead of grabbing the music and starting spinning around. So always follow the child's motivation. As far as the rules for positive reinforcement, the reinforcement, as we saw on the chart for the ABCs, always follows behavior. So it's not something that comes before the behavior is happening or right as the behavior is happening. Many of you may have probably heard of reinforcement promises. The first you do that, then you can get a cookie, or then we can go swimming. So first I need your shoes on, then we can go to the park. Those eventually are reinforcement promises, just in the sense that you are letting the child know, first I need you to do this, then this is what the consequence is going to be, this is what the reinforcement will be, just to put out there what's expected for the child's behavior to be. So you are expecting for the child to engage in putting his shoes on behavior, to go to the park or go swimming. And you're putting out there just a contingency, explaining to the child what's expected. Very different from a bribe of me saying, hey, if you stop crying in the middle of crying, if you stop crying, I give you a cookie. If you stop crying, I'll give you candy. Because eventually what you are doing is promising a reinforcement as the behavior is happening and not following it. And eventually, in this case, you would be reinforcing the crying and the bad behaviors. But say following an appropriate behavior, a good example would be the touch your nose example. So touch your nose, and before he touches his nose, I say, hey, if you touch your nose, I can give you candy. That would be bribing. And in that sense, my reinforcement is not following the behavior. I'm promising it beforehand, and it's not very clear that it just follows it. So reinforcement is very much more effective when it follows the behavior as a surprise. It follows the behavior right after it without mention of it before. A preferred item, like I mentioned with the stickers and everything else, doesn't always act as a reinforcer. And the value of the reinforcer shifts and changes, so motivation must be considered. You can only reinforce behavior that is happening, behavior that the child is currently engaging in or currently engages in. So that is usually not your target behavior. We're going to go into that last point in my next slide. But first I wanted to quickly touch on the fourth point, which is the value of the reinforcer shifts and changes. So motivation must be considered, in the sense that when choosing reinforcers, there is a big group of people that believe that it's better for instruction time to limit access to the reinforcers completely. It doesn't mean really depriving the child of those reinforcers, but I believe in a happy medium. I believe in a happy mix of you can have the reinforcers available but not readily available. Why? The reason why is very specific. If I have as a reinforcer a Curious George book, for example, and but the book is laying around all the time and the child has free access to it all the time, and then I sit down and start instruction and use that book as a reinforcer, that may not hold enough value. Why? Because the child has seen it. He has ready access to it. He can get it anytime. He doesn't have to work for it at any other time. Only when I am presenting an instruction and saying, hey, do this, and then we can read the book. What value does it have if he has access to that book anyway? If it's laying out there at the house or in his room all the time, then he's not going to want to work for that. The motivation is not present at all. And although that book could be a potential very strong reinforcer, at that time the value of that is not high enough for me to have him work for that item. Shaping behavior, and this I wanted to go into following the last point of the reinforcement rules. And this is a principle that stems off a reinforcement principle that we all use in the behavior analytic approach to therapy. That rule that we just read was you can only reinforce behavior that is happening, behavior that the child currently engages in. So basically, what I'm saying is if my target goal is for the child to touch his or her head, when I say touch head, but that is not happening right at this point, and I can only reinforce behavior that is happening. I can't just sit down and wait around until that happens out of the blue. I can't wait for that behavior to happen. I can only reinforce what is happening. That is not happening. So what can I reinforce? And that's where the shaping procedure stems off of. So how do we use reinforcement to teach new skills? We use shaping, and shaping is reinforcing successive approximations to that desired behavior. Systematically, you reinforce every approximation to it. You pick a beginning behavior to reinforce, and then you shape it into the target behavior that you are looking for. We use it to teach new behaviors or new skills, and like I said, we shape it from a response that the child is able to complete right there. So looking at the assessment chart and looking at everything that we completed as far as what the child is able to do, we have the different target goals, but getting there is a process. Getting to that target goal is a process, and we use reinforcement for that, and we use this shaping procedure. Examples of shaping procedure would be one that I love using, and it's transitioning appropriately. Say that a child is at the park and the target is to transition from the park to the car, and the child maybe has issues transitioning because he doesn't want to leave the park and go home. And I see that very often. So he doesn't want to leave the park and go home. He's not following the instruction to come to the car, and he melts down right away. If my target behavior is going from the park to the car, and that is a good 30 steps of walking all the way to the car, I can't really wait to reinforce getting to the car. My target behavior could be transitioning from the park to the car and sitting in the car with no crying, with no melting down. But I can't reinforce that because it's not a behavior that's currently happening. Currently what's happening is as soon as I say, let's go home, time to leave the park, he melts down. So the shaping, the way shaping would work here is you identify a specific reinforcer. That could be maybe a transition item. It can be anything, maybe sticks, or maybe a toy that the child likes, or maybe even a handheld video game, or a camera, or something that he enjoys holding. And what you do is look for things behaviors that he's engaging in before the meltdown happens. So behaviors that are happening that are appropriate right in that whole chain of events. So say the child is running around, I call his name and he looks at me, and then I maybe say, come here, hold my hand, and he holds my hand. Then as soon as I say, it's time to go home, he melts down. The goal for the shaping procedure would be to then begin with holding my hand, or begin with looking at me when I call his name, and reinforcing that at that very moment before that behavior begins. And then eventually, slowly and gradually, my reinforcement will happen when he holds my hand, then maybe when he walks two steps with me, maybe 3 steps, 5 steps, eventually 30 steps, and eventually I can leave the reinforcer, the handheld video game, in the car and just say, hey, let's go to the car. He's going to the car, and I reinforce only when he sits in the car nicely, and we're able to drive home with no problem. Increasing on-task behaviors can be another example of shaping behavior, because if we are looking, the target behavior is to teach the child to sit down for 30 minutes, or say 15 to make it a little more realistic. Say 15 minutes of sitting down and working on a task. I can't really begin by sitting the child at the table and expecting him to sit and just be on task for 15 minutes, because I'm going to reinforce at the end of those 15 minutes If that's not a behavior that's happening, I can't reinforce that. So what I do is look for something that is happening. How long can he stay on task? Can I get a baseline for that? Can he stay on task with something that he enjoys doing? Maybe not the worksheet for the beginning. Maybe I can just give him a puzzle that he loves and I know he can sit there for a little while. So let's give him the puzzle, sit him at the table, and see if he can stay there for 1 minute or 2 minutes. Say 1 minute, maybe even 30 seconds is your beginning point, and then he's up and running. Well, take those 30 seconds and that's what you begin with. That's what you reinforce. And then you gradually reinforce approximations to your goal, which is 15 minutes. Manding and requesting for wants and needs is another good example of shaping behavior. I'm going to go into more detail for manding, so I'm going to skip this one right now. But shaping behavior, just the 3 steps for doing that procedure will be to identify your target behavior and identify your baseline. So your target behavior in the transition would be 30 steps all the way to the car. Your baseline would be what he's currently doing, which is holding my hand when I say, come here, can you hold my hand? And then the 3rd step would be to choose gradual approximations and begin reinforcing. Another procedure that we use and goes hand in hand with shaping and reinforcement as well is called errorless training and prompting. Errorless training reduces errors completely, like the name says it. Errorless, there's no errors. And the way that's done is a prompt or a hint is delivered right after the instruction and before the child responds. So right before the child responds or has a chance to do it, I'm jumping in with my hint or my prompt to be able to reinforce the correct response. In this case, the response is prompted, but I'm reinforcing that, and with shaping, I'm gradually moving into an independent response to eventually teach the child to do it independently and reward that alone, not my prompting. So here's how it works. The instruction is the A, the B is the child's response, the C is reinforcement. So in this case, again, with our touch nose example, the instruction is touch nose, and you immediately, before he has a chance to respond, prompt him hand over hand. So you take his hand and touch his nose with his hand, and then basically that is the behavior itself. You did assist, but that is the behavior. And you say, yes, that's your nose, and give the reinforcer. Whatever that reinforcer is, whether it is the social acknowledgement and the social praise, and that would be it. Maybe a high five, great, that's your nose. The key to that is that it was errorless. If you were to just say touch nose at this point, if touch nose is your target goal based on your results from the assessment, you're starting basing it from the fact that he doesn't know to touch his nose. So that is not a known skill. So if you were prompting that, that behavior would be an error, and then you would have to go into correcting that error. And for ABA approach and the verbal behavior approach, most of them use the errorless training method, and in this way it minimizes almost just it prevents completely any error, because you are prompting right before and reinforcing the right response. And with shaping, like we just talked about, you can gradually change that prompt into an independent response and continue reinforcing that. And here is how you fade that prompt, because the prompt, it was hand over hand first for touch nose. So you grab the child's hand and touch his nose with his hand. Eventually you want to fade that so that he learns the independent response. And so you began with hand over hand, which was the physical. Then you can go into a manual guidance prompt, which is just sort of using your hand as a shadow, following the child's hand. In case he doesn't go all the way to his nose, you can go ahead and go with the hand over hand again. So it's just kind of shadowing. The partial prompt is more maybe just tapping his hand or tapping his shoulder as you say touch nose, so you're just partially prompting him, the child, to engage in the response. Modeling would be you just say touch nose as you touch your nose. So you're modeling to the child what to do and what the behavior that's expected. And the last one would be just verbal, maybe touch nose, where's your nose? And you're kind of helping verbally, prompting him to touch his nose appropriately. And this way, I won't go into detail as far as how to reinforce all of them or how to do the fading gradually, but this is the way the prompts are faded so that eventually you end up with a fully independent response and you're able to reinforce the child for engaging in that response independently, and then that skill becomes a mastered skill. To give you an example, man training, and this is like we spoke about earlier when we looked at the chart and talked about the verbal operants. Man training is specifically requesting training. Man stands for request, so it is request for access to items, activities, request for attention from others, request for information. And manding is an integral part to ABA, especially the verbal behavior approach. The reason why is because it's based on having needs met. So it has an immediate positive benefit to the child, and it's very reinforcing. Eventually, with man training, you build a very positive experience for the child. You're teaching him to request items, and you're teaching lots of language in a very fast-paced, systematic way, and there is an immediate positive benefit to the child. And motivation is always present when you're teaching man training, because eventually the child won't ask for something or ask for information if that antecedent, that motivation, is not there. My consequence is always a positive reinforcement consequence, because I'm giving that child that item that he's asking for, or that information that he's asking for. As we see here in the chart with antecedent, behavior, and consequence, the antecedent would be the motivation for the item that he's asking for. And the behavior would be the actual mand, and the consequence is the item or the information that the child obtains after the behavior. In order to teach that skill appropriately, and this is something that is done for every skill that you're teaching as far as your individualized plan, usually there's antecedent manipulations or things that you can do to make this more motivating for the child to engage in the behavior, so that ultimately you can reinforce. And for manding specifically, these are little things that can be done in order to create that motivation and create more opportunities. First one is a sanitized environment. It provides an opportunity to ask for items. Like I just gave you the example with the Curious George book on the floor, readily accessible. If things are all around, the child really doesn't have much of an opportunity to ask for an item. If things are put up, or maybe he can see in clear bins, you have a clear bin with lots of books in it and he likes books, and an adult can reach it, then you're building some opportunities for the child to approach an adult and ask for that item. Observing the child is definitely important, like we mentioned when we were going over reinforcement and how to determine and pick out various reinforcing items. Observing the child is key, because you want to make sure you know what the child is interested in. So are there any particular interests? And specifically when you're beginning instruction, that same day of your instruction, you just want to observe the child for the first couple of minutes, see how he's feeling, see what toys he's going for, what he seems interested in. Play with toys to create that motivation to interact, so that instruction time can just begin with lots of play from the instructor. Again, where the instructor is just providing lots of different opportunities, building different elements into the activities that the child is engaging in, like with the music, the example that I gave you earlier, and the child is motivated to interact with that instructor, and that's key, because you're building opportunities for that child to ask for, hey, more spins, sing more, now dance more, let's jump. You're building opportunity for not only requesting for things, but also lots of social interaction with the instructor. And that is pairing with the instructor. By pairing really refers to associating the instructor with reinforcement. So if the instructor, like I just gave you the example with the music earlier, if the instructor is there and he's providing way more fun than the child could get on his own, then that the reinforcer of social interaction with the instructor is very valuable to the child. And basically what we want to get to is in the instruction relationship, instructor-child relationship, is when the child sees the instructor, he doesn't see work, but he sees lots of access to things he enjoys, lots of play, lots of fun. And usually with ABA programs or with verbal behavior programs, you rarely see it as a work session. You see it more as a play session where the child is having lots of fun, and that just basically means that that instructor has successfully paired with all the reinforcers the child is working with. The main point for manding specifically is that if the child has free access, then they don't need to communicate. So for mand training, in this case, we're teaching the mand candy. And I chose a very beginner manding training because it is the easiest example I can give you as far as how to prompt and fade that prompt and how to use the reinforcement and how all of that is structured into the individualized ABA plan. So many different vocal outputs can be chosen for that mand. It can be sign, vocal, or PECS. That is the picture exchange communication system, or a different output device. So again, I have my ABCs. So I have my antecedent, which is my instruction. What do you want? And I prompt right away. So I'm using errorless training. I say, what do you want? Candy. Right away. So what do you want? Candy. As the child repeats, candy. By this example, I am assuming, and that would be based on the assessment, assuming that the child can echo behavior, verbal behavior, meaning he can echo something I say, and that would be assessed on the echoics column of the assessment. So if the child can echo, then this is a good training strategy. So I can say, what do you want? Candy. He repeats right away, candy, and I give him candy. If it were with a sign, same thing. I want to make sure he approaches, and then I say, what do you want? Candy. I sign candy. He signs candy, and then as a consequence, the candy is given. I think I'm missing a slide. Yeah, sorry, I'm missing a slide. But what I wanted to also make sure we described was that for these antecedents, specifically in teaching mand training, teaching to ask for candy, I want to make sure the child is approaching, and maybe I'm thinking that he may want to work for candy, so I pull out the candy. I'm teaching him to ask for candy. I want to make sure the motivation is there. The reason why is because the reinforcer is the candy, right? So I'm expecting that candy to be a good enough, a pleasant consequence that will eventually increase that behavior, which is saying candy when I ask, what do you want? So in order to assess that motivation, if it's present or not present, I can just hold out the candy and see if the child is reaching for it. If the child is reaching for it and I can see that there's motivation, then I can go right away and prompt and ask, what do you want? And eventually my prompt would be candy. If you remember my fading example, fading of the prompts for touch your nose, it was hand over hand, and then it was a partial prompt, and then a model prompt, and then a verbal prompt. In this case, the prompts would be very similar for the sign, since you're using motor movement. So you, when you do what do you want, you immediately grab the child's hand, just like with the touch nose example, and you hand over hand do candy. So you do the candy sign. It's not a model prompt in that sense. You are actually doing it for the child. So it's a hand over hand prompt for him to sign candy, and then you give the candy right away. You fade that out so that it's at first you are doing hand over hand to sign candy. Then the second step would be you just kind of shadow the child's hand, make sure he's touching his cheek appropriately. and then you just partially prompt, maybe just tap the child's hand. When you say, what do you want, tap their hand so that they sign, and then you give the candy. And then eventually it would be just a what do you want, and the child is signing candy on his own. This is very fast-paced, so it's not just a one trial that I do today and then tomorrow I do it again. I want to fade out my prompts right away, trial after trial. I'm doing plenty, just multiple repetitive trials, one after the other, making sure that the motivation is still there. Always I can vary it with different instructions. High five, let's dance and read a book, and then let's come back, maybe I pull the candy out again and begin instruction again. So it is very fast-paced the way you're fading and prompting. For the vocal one, the prompts would be vocal, so you begin with the full vocal candy. So what do you want? Candy. He repeats candy and you give candy. And the fading out of that is just a partial verbal where you just go, what do you want? Ca, expecting the child to fill in candy. Or can, he repeats candy. And then he's given the candy. Again, it comes after many, many trials of saying, what do you want? Candy. He repeats candy. You give him candy. What do you want? Can, and he says candy because you've been doing it so much that you're able to fade that out to just a partial prompt. And then eventually the last prompt would be, what do you want? You're quiet. Maybe you can very quietly say it. You can decrease the volume of your prompt to fade it out, or in many cases you don't need it at all. In many cases the partial prompt is not needed for the vocal teaching, and the child is able to just say candy right away after your what do you want instruction or question. And for the PECs, eventually the prompts and the fading would also be physical, so it would be maybe approaching the book to grab the picture and then hand it over to the instruction. To the instructor. So it would be again a physical hand over hand, then going backwards, fading it to a partial prompt, then a model prompt, then maybe a verbal prompt. So you're also fading that out quickly. Later on, as you teach that one, and this is just the example of a very early learner that doesn't have many words, you want to teach that child many Mands for very specific desirables. So for very specific things, maybe the reinforcers, if you did your list and you know what that child engages in during free time and what he prefers, then those would be great Mands to begin with. So if it's candy and movie, and juice, those are three great Mands to begin with teaching, because there's that motivation for them. And it's very important to be specific. I have many parents that want to teach yes, no, more, please. I usually stay away from them if there is not a strong Manding repertoire to begin with, because we want to be very specific, and also being that specific allows us to reinforce Manding more. If the child says please and we don't know what he wants specifically, he can't gain access to that right away. He many times doesn't get access to it right away because we don't know what he wants, and eventually that Mand right there goes without reinforcing. And also something else is that that more Mand or the yes Mand may become overgeneralized, where the child is using it for everything. And basically my sign for more or my sign for please means mommy, means juice, means cookie, it means everything. So at that point it's very important to be specific. And gradually, eventually, you can, working off the assessment charts and just working off the skill tracking system, you can gradually teach the child to ask for specific attributes, so big ball, red candy, door, a movie, following exactly the same teaching structure that we looked at when teaching candy. And then you can include Mands for others to engage in actions like push, open, give me, teach 2 and 3 word Mands like action, noun Mands, push car, open bag, blow balloon, and then later include I want. And you can eventually just move up the list and begin later teaching asking for questions. So asking what is it questions, where is it, who is it, asking for information for others. And you use exactly the same structure that we just looked at earlier, and you use your ABCs, you use the reinforcement, the shaping, the prompting, and the fading, and those are just, again, cornerstone procedures and strategies that we use in ABA to encourage learning, and specifically for the MAN training language. The highlights of ABA, or the verbal behavior instruction, is that is gradual. So like we saw with shaping, it's not a very quick process, but it's very gradual. We determine what the target goals are, and then move gradually towards the goals. So it becomes a very positive experience for the child. I'm not asking of him more than he can give me at that time. Eventually, I will be fading my prompts and requiring him to engage in a better response for me to reinforce, but it always stays very positive because of my reinforcement. It is fast-paced, like I mentioned with the prompting and the fading. It is very fast-paced. It is incidentally teaching the child, so that means that I'm just using very natural opportunities throughout the day. It's natural environment training to teach that. So we're not necessarily sitting at the table with a bag of candy right in front, but we're just playing, rolling on the floor, maybe going outside, going swimming. As I see opportunities for candy to be shared, maybe it's snack time, I'm teaching to ask for candy. So I'm teaching incidentally, and that allows for generalization of skills. A quick note on that, this specific all the procedures and the strategies that I mentioned are part of the natural environment training, and that is very beneficial for many children, but many other children benefit from more specific structured instruction, and that is direct instruction. It's referred as discrete trial teaching, and that can be very beneficial for many children. Eventually, for manding and teaching to request and teaching language, it is usually more beneficial to begin with an incidental type of training and the natural environment training, because you can generalize those skills, and the child is not only learning to ask for things and request for things sitting at the table and in a specific structured setting, but all around and across the board with different people in their home, outside in the community, and so it allows for the language to grow more. And then, like I mentioned, you can elaborate and bring different elements of language into what you're teaching when you're teaching naturally. Also, another highlight of ABA and VB is that because behavior is analyzed in terms of function, teaching specific replacement behaviors can reduce the occurrence of problem behaviors. So in this case, if I had a child that was engaging in escape behaviors or avoidance, and I saw that through my barriers assessment, so I see that there's some behaviors that are impeding learning, I can go ahead and teach specific replacement behaviors. That refers to a behavior that shares the same function as that problem behavior. So if I know the behavior that the child is exhibiting is to escape or avoid working, because he doesn't like long worksheets and doesn't really approach the table, doesn't want to sit at the table, and there's avoidance behavior surrounding the table or the structured setting, the work setting, I want to teach him a specific behavior that is more appropriate than throwing the puzzle across the room or throwing the worksheet on the floor. I want to teach him maybe to ask for a break because it serves the same function. He's avoiding task or he's escaping it by engaging in an appropriate behavior and saying, I want a break. And that eventually can reduce the occurrence of problem behaviors. Something else is if the child doesn't have many communication skills and he doesn't have the request component, that operant is not well developed, demanding, then you may see problem behaviors. They can't communicate their needs and wants, and so you may see lots of problem behaviors that are specifically serving an access function. They want access to things and they're unable to communicate what they want. And eventually they may learn to communicate by hitting others and maybe obtaining attention from their family members by hitting or by engaging in different problem behaviors. So we want to teach them a replacement behavior that serves the same function, that gets attention. So maybe teach them to tap instead of hit, or ask for help, or ask for specific things. And manding is a great replacement behavior for those specifically. So if there's any child that is looking for attention inappropriately, usually mand training is a great instruction program to follow to reduce the occurrence of those problem behaviors. Another highlight of the ABA and VB instruction is that it's very child-specific and individualized. So like you saw with all the assessments, it's very individual to every child and child-specific in the way you develop your instruction, because you are always preparing or structuring the sessions around the child's motivation, what the child likes, what the child enjoys, how the child works, what he responds best to, and how he interacts with his environment. So it's very child-specific. And again, the goals are very measurable and specific. All the goals are specific. Data is collected frequently to see if there's any progress. And with the assessments and the skill tracking systems, you can see exactly what strategies are working, what the child has learned, and if learning hasn't taken place, you can specifically modify instruction to meet the needs of that specific child. And that is all. I do have a sheet of references with very good books on verbal behavior approach and applied behavior analysis if you're interested, as well as my contact information. I will be sharing the presentation with Amy via email, so I believe it will be available on the website. I don't have many details, but I know this presentation will be up if there are any questions.